Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the 200th episode of the Human Risk podcast. But you knew that because you've already listened to the 199th episode. And if you haven't, then I strongly recommend you do, because this is the second part of a discussion with behavioural science legends Paul Craven and Rory Sutherland, and some of the discussion refers back to things that were said in the last episode. Since you know what's coming, there's no need for a further introduction from me, and I'll take us right back into the conversation with Paul Craven, Rory Sutherland, and the odd interjection from me.
Can we just go back to something where we started about behavioural science and perception?
Yeah.
How do you get across your point better? How do you become more appreciative by your clients or customers? And I was talking to a friend of mine who he's retired now, but he used to run casinos in the US. Chain of casinos in the US.
Casinos or investment banks?
Casinos.
So same sort of thing, you might argue.
And I was asking him about ways that he could improve the service. He said, the main thing we ever did was psychological. And I said, go on, tell me more. And he said, we introduced a policy. So we used to get feedback from our clients and customers afterwards, and they'd be sent forms or emails or whatever it would be and come back. And we were running at, let's say, a satisfaction level of X. And he said, we introduced a new policy into the casinos. And he said, we called it I, hi, bye. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, if you were a member of staff and you saw someone walking into the casino, you would look them in the eye. If you were within about 10 feet, you had to say to them, hello, hi, how you doing? And if you saw them leaving, you had to make a point of saying goodbye. So I, hi, bye. And he said, we did this for a few weeks, and then we started receiving feedback forms about our service, and it became like X plus 40%.
Yeah.
People suddenly thought, this is an amazingly brilliant place. They hadn't changed the food or the drink or anything else. They just changed what you and I might call politeness, I guess. But they made sure that everybody made a point of doing that. And I'm sure others are more familiar with this who work in service industry than I am, but that small little change in behaviour for the staff meant that they were perceived as being the most fantastic service providers.
Walmart has a something foot rule where you have to acknowledge a customer if you're within a certain radius.
Yeah.
I'll find it out for you now. Yeah. That's fascinating.
So back to our conversation earlier about, is behavioural science or are there some aspects of it that are, is this mind control? No, it's just, we would call it polite good manners. But people like and appreciate polite good manners, and it reflects in their conscious or more likely their unconscious response to how good was your service when you weren't there today. I have another heuristic that I use and I use this a lot in business.
By the way, it's the Walton 10-foot rule.
Okay.
Just to note, in Walmart.
Okay.
Yeah. You have to greet someone.
Yeah. Within 10 feet, you have to say, yeah. But these small things make a huge difference. A disproportional, and this is kind of where the alchemy comes in, to use Rory's great metaphor, because it shouldn't be like that, but it is. And I think about some of my little things that I've done over the years, or the way my mental shortcuts, my little heuristics that I may have had. And the one thing that I do, and I know that I'm not the only one to do this, because whenever I mention to people, they say, yeah, I do that as well. Watch how people treat waiters and waitresses. Watch them if they acknowledge them. If someone says, yeah, thank you, as a plate's being put down, or even just nods or a hand signal as if to say, I know what you're doing. But if I find someone that just lets a waitress or waiter put a plate down in front of them and doesn't even acknowledge they've done that, my guards are up immediately, because I think that little lacking that civility or polity probably may well reveal other stuff later on in the business sense that I don't particularly like. And so that...
I mean, I think, by the way, the question you've raised and the I, hi, bye, now, of course, it's worth remembering a lot of the people going to casinos are playing the slots, so there isn't even any human interaction in their gambling, okay? The majority of people are probably slot machine players rather than card players. And it raises a really important question for modern retail, which is if you have automated checkout and self-scanning, okay, the need for that personal contact. Because one of the things I noticed, which is a bit strange, is my parents shopped in a way that was basically they went to a load of different shops in the village and, bought different things at different shops. And in each occasion, they had a little bit of personal interaction. And you mentioned this about deal, didn't you, Paul? Which is you actually like running errands.
Yep.
You go down the high street and you go into 10 different shops. You have a little bit of personal engagement and exchange in every single one. And you come back with a sort of feeling of success that you've assembled this shop from 10 different retailers. Okay. And it suddenly occurred to me that, of course, when I was in my 30s, I did the big shop at Sainsbury's or the big shop at M&S if I was flush, and that just seemed an improvement on what my parents had done. But weirdly, at the age of 56, I find myself reverting to some extent to the retail behaviour of my parents, where I go into Sevenoaks and interact with 8 other people. Now, one thing that might enable this a little bit is contactless payment and things like this. So the friction of going to different places has been reduced. Maybe we just have an appetite for human interaction and exchange, which technology is actually depriving us of to some extent.
Rory, is this the retail equivalent of your doorman fallacy?
Yeah, exactly that. It is the retail equivalent.
Which you might want to explain. Because it's...
So the doorman fallacy is this thing where you get McKinsey in to look at a hotel and they work out how much your doorman costs. And then they work out immediately how much you'd save by replacing the doorman. They define the doorman's function as opening the door because he's called a doorman, okay? And having defined the doorman's function as door opening services, they effectively then make a case for replacing the doorman with an automated door opening mechanism, which will bring you a saving of, because they're a consulting firm, they've probably got a little back deal with the automatic door company as well, okay? And they... I'm joking, okay? But, and then they install, and they lay claim to the saving, okay? And then they walk away. And what you've done actually is you've created a visible saving at the price of an invisible cost, because in reality, the doorman's functions are much, much broader than door opening. They're recognition for regular patrons, for example. Security, it's another aspect. Exchanging information with other doormen about problem guests. There are all sorts of things being performed.
What's the weather be like today, you might say to a client, or having a nice day, or...
Yeah, do you need an umbrella?
Or can I
get you a taxi?
Can I help you with your bags? There's so much...
Can I help you with your bags? Okay?
But none of these appear on a bloody spreadsheet.
And none of them appear on a spreadsheet, despite the fact they have a kind of value to them. And what then happens is they lay claim for the cost saving. That's then reported upwards to your investors, which is labour cost savings through automation. And all the investors in the city go, marvellous. Yeah, I see you've achieved labour cost savings here. Unfortunately, 2 years later, the hotel's lost a star. There's a vagrant asleep in the doorway, and the most regular patrons don't stay there anymore. Okay, but none of that actually appears in terms of the wider evaluation of the value of replacing a doorman with an automatic door.
And so the shopping thing is a bit like that, because you're getting interaction with lots of people. And again, humans, I think most humans crave some sort of interaction. It reminds us of the sort of social species we are, which you may or may not get when you buy 100 items in a supermarket and flash your card and off you go. Whereas if you go into individual shops, now I wouldn't claim to get a 10 shots at a time. I just want to state the truth there. But
if we had human economics, which is we actually rewarded people in terms of the human perceived value they created, rather than purely on what you might call a sort of reductionist model of business efficiency, I think you'd end up with, by the way, airline check-in staff or call centre staff who are paid £70,000, £80,000, £90,000 a year, or up. Okay, because I don't think it's implausible that the difference between your best call centre person and your worst call centre person, in terms of customer loyalty and other long-term effects, wouldn't justify that level of salary for the very good people. It's difficult to measure and it's slow to measure, so it generally doesn't get measured. But I had a Vodafone experience on online chat. I have no idea who the person was, but they were a genius. I actually left not only with my problem solved, but feeling like feeling great. I mean, I can only describe it like that. Now, this was a call about mobile phones, for God's sake, right? And so, we need to accept the fact that actually, Deirdre Witkowski makes this point, that about a third of economic value is what she calls sweet talk. It's just getting people to feel better about doing things. It's getting people to agree with other people that maybe they'll do something together. A huge amount of the economy, I think it's a 33% estimate of GDP, basically rides on sweet talk. And yet what we do instead of saying, actually, how can we make the doorman even more valuable? We define the doorman's role in a manner which makes him susceptible to automation. We then automate him and we lay claim to the savings without actually quantifying the costs.
I think a similar principles applied when you think about business presentations, because and obviously I sort of run workshops on how to do these better. And the first thing I tend to say to people is, right, what's your client's objective? And they look at me as if I've asked some sort of ridiculous question. I say, well, it's our objective that matters. I say, no, what's your client's objective? Because when you go into that meeting with them, what did their client want to get out of it? And it amazes me. I would say that sort of most people have never thought what the client's objective is. They might be able to waffle something quickly, but they're so concerned with their own objective, they forget who's on the other side of the table. And then, part of the workshop is, right, let's go through your presentation, and I'll have a long, boring presentation in my industry, in the investment industry. Too often the norm is a long, boring technical presentation. And I've always likened it to someone trying to sell how a car works and trying to explain how the engine works. And this is what and I said, most people when they go to buy a car, yeah, there will be some techies amongst them that want to know some specs and everything else. But actually it's how they sit, how they feel it. Is he got enough boot space for the golf clubs? Can my husband or wife drive it? Will it be comfortable with the kids?
Usually put, Kumal Galhotra, who's the head of Ford North America, says that car making is 100,000 rational decisions in search of one emotional decision.
Brilliant. But they pack these CC presentations full of so many stats. And, I remember, I don't want to know how the bloody engine works. I want to have an awareness that it's being run by good people, that the car will work. But I'm not, if I wanted to know how the engine works, I'd be in your industry, right? I'd be a car mechanic, or I'd be an asset manager.
But there's a really obvious clue that that's not necessary, because if you think about, I always talk about the driver's manual. So we design the average car so a driver can get in and probably make it move. And if you don't know what to do, you go to this document that's structured around answering your question, pictures, things. They don't give you the engineering manual because you don't need that, because you're not engineering, you're driving. And I think that's, to your point, Paul, it's a really interesting thing about, there are really good examples out there where we get it.
Yep.
User manuals that are actually useful as opposed to technical manuals.
But too many presentations that I've seen, and again, in my workshops, I try and, what I do, I'll tell you what I do. I get the hold of their presentation and I give them 3 pens. I give them it's a traffic light thing. It's a red highlighter, an amber highlighter, and a green highlighter. And I'll say, I'm going to give you 3 different concepts now to go through your presentation with. Every time that you tell a client about a feature of your firm or the way you manage money, I want you to use the red highlighter. Every time you talk about an advantage that the way you do something over, say, your rivals, or the way you could beat the market, or whatever it may be, use the amber one. And every time you talk about a benefit to the client, use the green one. And when they hand me back the presentations, it is probably 70% red,
Lovely.
20% amber, and if I'm lucky, 10% green. In other words, they don't talk about benefits to the client. Now, again, going back to what's the client's objective, the client's objective is, I want to employ you for whatever reason it may be. Tell me the benefits of me using you. But people don't do that. And it's an old-fashioned thing called FAB, F-A-B, features, advantage, benefits. And literally, now, here's the thing there. What you can't do is just fill it full of benefits, because otherwise it sounds fluffy and unbelievable. You have to have the right blend of facts, figures, data alongside benefits to the client. But too often, most presentations are too many features, not enough advantages, and certainly not enough benefits. And it's trying to get that balance right. And it's extraordinary that humans react well to benefits. They don't react well to, you're so bloody clever because you've got 8,000 offices around the world.
It's very interesting that when David Ogilvy wrote the ad, at 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise in the new Rolls-Royce is the ticking of the electric clock. Okay. The engineers at Rolls-Royce were really annoyed by the advertisement, because they'd spent 5 years working on the drivetrain, and they wanted the ads to be about the engineering superiority. And what David was talking about was ostensibly, I say ostensibly because obviously it says much more than it says, was how noisy the clock was. If you think about it, you can understand why that's annoying. If you're an engineer, you want to talk about the things that you believe are to your unique status advantage as an engineer. That's what you're proud of. And so it is, I think, absolutely vital. And this is why, by the way, I think, particularly in businesses which have a strong engineering, technological, or financial focus, there's a natural dislike of marketing because it forces you to think at a 90-degree angle to the way you normally think. And in some ways, it's your status is improved by how well you perform as a specialist, which may be actually only tangentially interesting or not at all interesting to the actual customer of what you do. And that was, in a sense, Jobs's great genius was translating technological, I won't even say prowess, but technological competence into human magic. If you ever see, I once went to a talk by Johnny Ive, and I have to say, he's a wonderful guy, and it was a fantastic talk. That even for me, there was a bit more talk about bezels than to be honest, I probably would have wanted, okay? And I love a good bezel, but my God, there was a focus on bezels.
No one likes a good bezel more than you.
And they suddenly realized the nature of a curve, which is irrelevant. And indeed, the engineering people within Apple didn't like Steve. I mean, they said, I don't get what Steve even does, like he can't even code, right? And that's very interesting. I mean, we were making the point, I think, weren't we, that none of the Beatles could read music, by the way. That there's a certain, instinctive soft skill. Well, I suppose what we're talking about is tacit ability versus explicit ability as well. And, bezels are a kind of, the decision has to be tacit. There's no guidebook. It's a matter of taste and judgment. But it is utterly fascinating, I think, the extent to which large organizations actually become misaligned with the customer as a product of how they're structured. And there's a famous thing I think Jack Welch said, didn't he, which is, and I think it was his kind of criticism of the shareholder value movement, which is you end up with an organization where all the employees are orientated with their tongue towards the chief executive and their ass towards the customer.
Very good. Very good.
Love that. I'm struck that if we look at what we use human capital for in the 21st century, and to your points, Rory, around what gets value, there's an interesting thing here that says the things that are much more important, the skills that maybe we need, the things that people should be studying. And I'm struck that all three of us working behavioural science, and yet none of us studied anything that's remotely relevant. In my case, it was French and German, which being Oxford is all literature and medieval French, utterly quote unquote useless in the real world.
My wife did that. It would do all the chanson de Roland and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but I've realized with hindsight, actually, all of those stories, I was going through and looking at, and let's pretend I read all the books that I should have read. I certainly wrote essays about them, but that doesn't mean there's any great knowledge of them. But as I look back, Sartre, the theatre of the absurd, actually fascinating for many real, Kafka, brilliant at looking at bureaucracy and some of those dynamics. And so I think it's fascinating that we've sort of all gravitated from different disciplines that have nothing to do with psychology or science. And yet that's where we've ended up. And that seems to me to be an interesting path.
Yeah, I mean, I did history at Cambridge all those years ago. And I think Rory, it's funny because Rory and I were both there at the same time, although Rory did classics and I did history. So we actually never met. Which is probably,
we're actually at sister colleges too, founded by the same person. Yeah,
probably just as well we didn't meet in those days because goodness knows what would have bored our friends stupid. But so I think history is very interesting though because it does help you, I think, get a perspective on things that historians have a perspective on things that is an interesting one, not least the one of time. And I'm always amazed by one of the great things in investment is all the noise that goes on in marketplaces and the volatility that seems to hide often what may be long-term trends with hindsight. And I add the word with hindsight there gladly because they're only obvious with hindsight. But I think if we're ever trying to do anything in investment, it's to differentiate between the signal and the noise. And there is so much noise around. And by the way, this applies to every different genre. Politics may be the best and most topical example because what we're looking for really is, as human beings, is signals, what's going to matter in the long term. And I think the media is probably, I wouldn't blame them for it because, if it bleeds, it leads and all those other good stuff. And we want to kind of whip up disunity, disharmony, because it's a better story than saying everyone's getting on fine. Isn't that interesting question, Rory? If you had to publish a newspaper once every 10 years or say 50 years, what would the headline be? Because it would be something like child mortality collapses, down to record low levels. That's a good headline. That's a good long-term trend. But that ain't going to sell any newspapers in the short term when you want to read about blood and guts and everything else.
I mean, it actually disturbs me because I would say, as a 56-year-old, objectively, for all its various failings, the UK is a pretty nice place to live. Okay, I've never really had the urge to emigrate anywhere else, even should the opportunity present itself. And there's a limited number of places I could contentedly go if I were to leave. Possibly not even including the United States now, I might add. I mean, if they'd only stuck with George III, it would have been much better. But I mean, instead they've decided to, center their entire national religion on a 200-year-old bit of paper, which doesn't seem quite as good. But no, interestingly, one of the things that I slightly worry is that our children are overexposed to negative news. And to some extent, you should actually enjoy your youth. I'm very glad they're socially concerned and socially conscious and so forth. But there is a bit of me which goes, for God's sake, you're in your 20s or 30s, you should be actually having a pretty good time rather than worrying about every single thing that could conceivably be presented in a negative light. And so, there's a wider question there of what are the negative effects on happiness and well-being that are created by this extraordinary profusion of noise. There's an interesting movement which I quite like, which I think is a signal versus noise movement, which is the dumb phone movement, where people get rid of smartphones and replace them with kind of Nokia phones. And the argument is that, now, to be honest, there's a bit too high a price there, because I would happily turn off social media on my mobile phone, 2 days out of 3. Perfectly healthy thing to do. I'm not sure I can give up the parking apps or the navigation apps quite so readily. But the dumb phone movement is effectively a philosophical movement which says actually, minimizing your access to information can generally enhance well-being because you focus on what matters, not on what's seemingly urgent or timely. And of course, social media give this extraordinarily distorted impression of everybody else's lives. Because, as someone put it very widely, you get everybody else's on-stage performance while you're living life backstage. They've got the scenery and the lighting, and you've got all the props and the bits of wood and, the old junk lying around, because that's mostly how life is lived. And then people effectively walk on stage, take a selfie of themselves, and walk off again, and you're left believing that everybody else's reality is somehow better than yours. I mean, it's undoubtedly, it's not what you might call a representative data set, Instagram.
Do you know the work of Tristan Harris?
I know of it.
Yeah, he's the guy who was at Google. He was a design ethicist, I think he called himself. And I think he's involved now with a Google called something like humanetech.com. And a lot of it is about how to reduce the distraction of the mobile devices we have. And I think he quotes that the average person with a smartphone checks it 150 times a day. That's right, 150. And
I think it's something like 30 to 40% of those checks are within 3 minutes of an earlier check.
Yep.
So there's evidence of compulsion. It isn't even evenly distributed. It's kind of slightly weird. And if you think about it, it's the first time, in a sense, what we didn't realize about old tech, and I'll even include things like the laptop in this, or the desktop computer, okay, is that for the previous, let's just say a few thousand years, okay, where you were affected what you could and couldn't do. So the being in a particular place obtained a kind of focus. With the photocopier room, you've photocopied. In the meeting room, you've met. In the reception room, you received people. Do you see what I mean? And we didn't realize, but the place we're in was automatically limiting our field of attention, our field of activity. And we saw that, I suppose, technologists saw that as a downside, that, you're constrained in what you can do by where you are. And of course, in some respects, it was a downside. I very much like the fact that I can turn on my central heating before I get home from a holiday, okay? Just a few hours before, just in case there are any, but, that's very useful. You don't get home to a freezing cold house or a damp house, okay? Yeah, that's very good. But actually, it also presents us with an appalling choice architecture in terms of what should I be doing now? And the answer is we end up doing the thing that seems salient or pressing, not the thing that's important.
Yeah.
It's why actually I think working on a train has become weirdly productive.
Yeah. Well, you should look up this stuff by Tristan Harris. I mean, the reason I got into him is because he's a magician. And again, just linking the magic and behavioural science bit, and he actually wrote a brilliant article. Christian, you should actually link the article to the notes on this on I think it's called medium.com. And it was called How Technology is Hijacking Your Mind. And he talks about it from a magician's point of view and as a Google designer's point of view. He's no longer there. And he talks about 10 different hijacks, the way that technology hijacks your mind. I won't go through them, but the article's well worth reading. So, for example, hijack 1 was, if you control the menu, you control the choices. Interestingly, talks about things like social approval. There's lots of sort of Cialdini type stuff in there, social approval, social reciprocity. But your smartphone is brilliant at getting both those two, the hijack 4 and hijack 5, those two boxes ticked. It's a really interesting way of thinking. My only quibble with it is that it's a little bit negative about some of it just focuses purely on the negatives. In other words, there's a lot of good stuff that could be done using the same things. The way to, ways of, it sounds a bit cheesy, the ways of improving humanity. A lot of these things could be applied in a good way or a bad way. He talks about how they're applied in a bad way. But it's a very interesting thing, and I was gripped by the article when I found it, because his first line was something like, magicians start by looking for blind spots, edges, vulnerabilities, and limits of people's perceptions, so they can influence what people do. And then he uses that as a segue into smartphones do exactly the same, by the way. So it's a really good article on Medium, and I would certainly recommend it.
No, and actually, this whole question of alchemy versus magic is fascinating, because it's completely wrong to design things like economics, for example, without acknowledgement of the limitations to human perception. There's a lovely story I always tell, which I heard of, which is an experiment which involved showing photographs to parrots, I think it might have been. And they couldn't understand at all the way the parrots reacted to the photographs, until someone pointed out that all photographs, as indeed is true of all screen images, what we're looking at right now, are optimized for higher primates. They're RGB, right? And everything we perceive about color is basically the relative strength or absence of red, green, and blue. And so gorillas would look at photographs and I think would see pretty much what we do. My primatologist may ring up and go, this guy's talking crap, but I'm pretty sure that the higher primates have the same system we do. A parrot, of course, will see a totally different color, because their eyes are not, they're sensitive to maybe 5 different colors, one of which might be ultraviolet. I have no idea. Okay. But the point is, snakes, for example, actually detect infrared and heat. So a snake would assume that anything in a photograph was dead, for example. Okay, right. Now, the point I'm making there is that designing an objective reality and presenting it to people without being alert to the perceptual effects and distortions that are part of our evolved phenomenology is just fundamentally mistaken. I mean, how do we perceive, a perfectly sensible question is, economists measure how rich people are. There's a secondary question, which is, how do people perceive that they're rich? What does wealth mean, by the way? What is the actual benefit? Now, I know that sounds getting into fluffy territory, and it is getting into fluffy territory, okay? But actually, it's still a really important question. Because, there's a wonderful phrase, I think, from an American humorist writer who says that a rich man is anyone who earns more than his wife's sister's husband. Okay. That's in 1950s. I'm just trying to remember who it is. It's one of those great American, H.L. Mencken, it probably is, okay. So that might be a very 1930s, slightly sexist view of the world. But it's not a bad point, is it, that quite a lot of perception of wealth is going to be relative. We don't wake up every morning and think how fortunate it is we aren't, Bolivian peasant farmers, okay? So you have to factor that in.
Have you read Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money? It's a very small book.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
It's absolutely brilliant. Do you remember the story he tells? I think very early on, it may even be the first chapter. He says, he talks about at a party given by a billionaire on Shelter Island, Kurt Vonnegut informs his pal Joseph Heller that their host, a hedge fund manager, had made more money in a single day than Heller had earned from his wildly popular novel Catch-22 over its whole history. And Heller replied, "Yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough."
Lovely.
So trying to define wealth, it's extraordinarily difficult. But I mean, just go back to the parrot and the how you perceive things and the way you're finding. I mean, humans have the same sort of problem, don't they? Because just by using a few different words to ask exactly the same question, you can completely change the answer. I'm always reminded of that. It was done a few years ago, but I think it's been off-quoted enough, and I think it's been replicated enough times to know it's true. If you ask people, do you support reducing the voting age from 18 to 16, support's about 37% and oppose is 56%. In other words, the majority oppose reducing. If you say, do you support or oppose giving 16 to 17-year-olds the right to vote, support goes up to 52%. So and oppose falls to 41%. So by framing in terms of reducing the age or giving something, you completely change of how human beings give their answer. And that to me is just, I mean, that's reframing again, back to that concept we started early on, but it's phenomenal that something as small as just changing a little bit of language, tiny language, can get a completely different answer.
So there are things that people do not see objectively, which they do see. And there are also things that they see, which you aren't aware that you're showing them. Okay. So, I mean, an example would be, I always give this little example of a story, which is, I simply say, if you run a small business, a shop, let's say, or dry cleaners, right? Here is how you can lose a customer for life. Allow them to turn up, come into the shop, and then say, sorry, we're closed. Okay? If you want to win a customer for life, lock the door at 3 minutes to 5, okay? If anybody comes along, remove the sign that says open or closed. If anyone comes along and tries the door, make a big show of unlocking the door and asking them to come in, right? Now, the ostensible distinction here is what is the closing time of the shop, okay? The real emotional takeout here is the first one is perceived as a massive insult, okay? And the second one is perceived as immensely flattering. It's actually got nothing to do with the opening hour of the store. It's me second-guessing what the store owner thinks of me. And there's a dry cleaner in Sevenoaks I haven't used for 10 years because he did that, I'm sorry, we're closed stunt. I go, I'm sorry, I'm not your fucking customer. And I haven't been back in 10 years, even though it's the most convenient dry cleaner to use. And there's a wonderful thing, actually, I'll tell you a lovely story about this. I was telling this, and someone came up to me and said that, I also made the point that if you run a cafe, have loads of tables and chairs outside on the pavement, even if it's kind of raining or cold, because it says 500 yards away, there's a cafe down there and it's open. It's free advertising, right? Because you wouldn't leave your chairs outside if you closed, right? So it's like a massive open sign. And a guy told me this wonderful story, which he said, yeah, you can do the opposite too. And I said, why would you want to do the opposite? He said, because I used to work in a cafe. I didn't own the cafe. I was paid to work till 4 o'clock when the cafe closed. And it was a pain in the arse if someone came in at 5 to 4, because we wanted to clean the cappuccino machine and piss off home and sweep the floor. We didn't want any customers in the last 15 minutes of operation because they delayed the time we could get home. So we discovered all you have to do is take one chair and put it upside down on top of another chair as though you're about to sweep the floor. Nobody comes in. Okay, if you put a chair upside down on a table or you put a chair upside down on another chair, no one comes into the cafe. And because they just go, my cafe experience is going to be shit because basically, people are going to be sweeping up around me or whatever, or they're just about to close. And so this thing of what we perceive and what we see versus what we're presented with, and this is where magic and alchemy, they all effectively come together. They are all undoubtedly about phenomenology, which is, what we perceive and how we read the world, what the world means to us as distinct from what it is. And my view is that public policy, great marketers are great phenomenologists. Dyson accidentally produced a vacuum cleaner that looked such a way and had such features that people were prepared to pay 700 quid for it, which would have seemed an impossibility to Miele, 2 years previously. Okay, they would have looked at the nice little normal distribution of vacuum cleaners with Miele towards the top and Henry towards the bottom, both very good brands, by the way, I might add. Okay, and they would have said, okay, there isn't really a market beyond this point. It's a distressed purchase, blah, 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 blah. The Uber map is a brilliant piece of, perceptual hacking. And by the way, I think if the objective of economics is to produce human happiness and well-being, rather than to produce a spurious model of efficiency, the Soviet style, this year we produced more rivets than we did last year, with no particular concern for whether the rivets were any good or actually, were actually useful. And I see increasingly the need for quantification and measurement and financial reporting and spreadsheet filling. I see it creating a kind of Soviet-style capitalism, to be honest, which is metrics-driven, target-driven capitalism, which is not really the comparative advantage that capitalism enjoys, is that ultimately the consumer makes the call. The person who is supposed to be the end beneficiary of the activity is the person who actually determines what value is.
And I think you can take that further. I mean, take it into the space that I operate in sort of compliance and looking at, often where we want to impose things on people and we don't think about, well, how is this going to make them feel? So I spend a lot of time working with clients where it's kind of like, well, we can tell them to do this because we employ them. So legal logic.
That's classic defensive decision making, because of course, by giving an instruction, you are protecting yourself without any responsibility over whether the actual instruction is obeyed or adopted in any shape or form. Because you've covered I told them to do this, they didn't do this, therefore it's not my fault. In terms of the fact that there's a massive principal agent problem with all employees, which is all employees, the business is trying to maximize wealth, the employee is trying to minimize the risk of blame. Okay? And so huge amounts of internal activity are basically arse covering. They're the corporate equivalent of stuffing a book down your trousers, in the 1970s boarding school level. Okay. And they're not really value creating at all. They're career defending.
I caught up, Rory, recently with an old friend of mine when I used to work at Schroders, who was an actuary. And before he was at Schroders, he was in an actuarial firm. And needless to say, with no offense to any actuaries, it was quite a sort of technical number orientated place. And this particular person, I won't name him, was quite a social person. And he obviously recognized the importance of having mathematical skills, but he also recognized the importance of social skills, particularly in a business like that. And once they'd sort of been through the interview process and, had all the geeky stuff done, he would take them on and they'd be expecting an interview with him and he'd take them down to the pub. And he wouldn't just take them down to any pub, he'd take them down to a pub where he knew there was a darts board. And even if they'd never played darts before, he wanted to play darts with them because he thought that was a very good way of quickly determining their mathematical skills. Could they take away from 501 consecutively? But also, more importantly, he wanted to gauge what they were like outside the office, whilst seemingly having a game of darts. How would they react? How would they play? And he felt that was a very important measure. And he claimed to me certainly that it was a good a way as any of interviewing somebody to see how successful they'd be in their role in the actuarial firm.
Well, that dual setting thing. I mean, I remember interviewing a candidate who was superb, and we liked him so much that we actually went to the bar with him afterwards. At which point, after 3 drinks, he turned into a complete arsehole.
Interesting.
And it reminded me of what the ancient Persians did, which is any major decision they debated twice, once while sober and once while drunk. And it was only if they agreed on the course of action in both settings did they actually proceed with it.
Yeah, there's a sort of parallel with that, and it was probably one of the best lessons I ever had in giving presentations. And it was my dear late friend, a gentleman called Bob Mobley from the US, who gave me some presentation coaching back in this would have been the mid-90s. And I remember he wasn't my friend, and I didn't know him, and I was very lucky enough to be asked to join his one-to-one training course, and I'd met him the night before briefly, and he'd said, look, tomorrow morning I want you to turn up outside the door, come in with your presentation and present as if you'd never met me before, and we'll see how it goes. And then I really did the preparation, made a big effort to do a good job. And sure enough, the following morning I knocked on the door, good morning, Mr. Paul Craven, Mr. Bob Mobley. Pleased to meet you. Please sit down over here. It was very formal, deliberately so. And he said, please start your presentation. And I gave him a booklet, and I opened my booklet and started off in the way that I'd been sort of taught to do it in sort of typical presentations of previously. And I talked about, we had this many offices around the world and blah, blah, blah. And after about 5 minutes, he said, okay, that's enough. He said, right, let's get to know each other. So tell me about the last holiday you went on. And I said, oh, and I relaxed and I said, look, yeah, I went to Mallorca when the kids were young and we did banana boating and ate well. And after about 3 or 4 minutes of small talk, he then said, right, back to page 4. Tell me about the process, your investment process. So I went back into presentation mode, did that. And then after another 5 minutes, and you may be jumping ahead and guessing what I'm about to say, he said, oh, about the holiday, what kind of stuff were you doing? Did you visit any museums or anything? And then he stopped me and said, right, we've had enough. And he said, I've been filming the whole thing. And I think these were the days when you could do what you like without telling clients you were doing it. And I said, what? He said, yeah, that camera there, you saw it. I said, yeah, I did see it, but I didn't think it was on. He said, let's watch it together. He said, then I'll give you the tape. And we watched it together. And for the first 5 minutes, when I'm in presentation mode, I'm sort of stiff-necked, really quite tight. I'm way, way, way too alert. I'm way, way, way too jumpy. I'm way too on edge. And I'm very formal. And then once he starts saying to me, what about your holiday? I'm more relaxed. I'm more conversational. I'm not using any jargon, obviously. I'm just talking normally, using normal English words as opposed to particularly investment-oriented words. And then he hops me back into presentation mode again. And on the movie, I can see myself going back to this first person again, this strange, slightly alien businessman. And then he takes me back to holiday mode again, and I relax. And he said, look, and the more he switched me, he did it 3 or 4 times, the more they became the same person. And by the end, that was the authentic Paul Craven talking, whether it be about business or about holidays. In other words, it was just much more normal. And I think when we create this shell, don't we, when we're in a business pitch? I mean, I'm not saying you do, Rory, I'm sure you don't, but many do. And when I try and teach people now in my presentation masterclasses, I don't film them secretly, let me make that very clear. But I'm very aware that just being conversational immediately breaks down a lot of barriers that you don't necessarily do if you're in, as I say, kind of stiff presentation mode. And it's very interesting, this whole concept of how you present yourself to the world when you're trying to get an idea across or try and be more persuasive. And, all these sort of psychological tips and tricks, if I can call them that, they won't guarantee you win the business. But if it's 50-50, whether you get the business or your opponent gets the business, guess what? It might just tip it to 52-48. Again, just using kind of behavioral science, communication, persuasion techniques, that's where I think this all comes back down to is how useful this stuff is in being a better communicator. Because if you're a better communicator, you're a better connector. And if you're a better connector, hopefully you can become a better human being. God, that sounds cheesy. But I know what I mean.
But it's interesting, right? Because I found, and I'm very struck, Rory, that you don't seem to have a business Rory and a personal one. I'm sure there are differences, but you are very much trading on being yourself, and you as well, Paul, for the avoidance of doubt. And I think that's interesting because there's a sort of traditional logic that says we go to work and we have to be different people. And then there's this whole bring your whole self to work question. And what I think is interesting is we've got to balance out, right? We don't want to have graduates coming into organizations and just sort of not recognizing it's a different and perhaps doing inappropriate things. But equally, we want humans' personality because, frankly, you don't want people being boring, and because otherwise we could just, that doesn't differentiate you. And particularly if you're buying a cognitive product, you want to make sure that you understand what it is you're buying, and that's the personality of the people, and do you want to work with them? And I found it very interesting where I've deliberately sabotaged client early processes where I've just thought, I can't work with you because you want me to present in a way that illustrates that you work in a way that I don't work in. And I think it's very interesting if we look at what's the differentiator in the 21st century. The closer you can be to being yourself without being unprofessional, I think it works both ways. That's a much more effective pitch process.
It also becomes easier when you're older. And
Yes.
I have to, one of the great things I suddenly noticed when I was about 45 is you can say things that are slightly banal or simplistic, but important. Okay. And there is this huge tendency, I think, when you're young, it's very difficult for you. There's a wonderful phrase, which I think is Buckminster Fuller's. I didn't realize this because I always used to have the phrase dare to be trivial, which is don't be ashamed of talking about things which are seemingly trivial, like whether staff greet customers or where your tables are, because in human perception terms, there isn't a conventional sense of proportion. Okay? Trivial things can communicate a lot. Big things can communicate nothing at all. You can replace the whole engine in a car and if nobody notices, actually it's completely pointless. You can put in a cute little feature in a car, some tiny little detail like dog mode on the Tesla, okay, which, kind of appeals to me even though I don't have a dog, right?
What the hell is dog mode, Rory?
Okay, so they realized that with an electric car, you can leave air conditioning on when you're not in the vehicle because you don't need to leave the engine running. There's a really great battery doing the job. Which means you can leave your dog in the car in Phoenix, Arizona, while you're going into Whole Foods to buy your groceries, right? But then they realize there's a problem because other people not realizing it's an electric car, people from PETA or general people concerned about animal welfare, will assume it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit inside the car and will smash your windows to rescue the dog, you see? And so you can set dog mode and it says, it puts a big picture of a dog up on the screen, which is displayed if anybody approaches the car. And it says, don't worry, I'm at comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit. My owner will be back in 10 minutes to stop the people smashing the car to release it. Okay. And those, so trivial things like dog mode can mean much more than, another 20 miles of range or something in terms of people's propensity to like the car, talk about the car, everything else. And so, anyway, interestingly, Buckminster Fuller has this phrase, not dare to be trivial, but dare to be naive. And one thing that's useful about being older is you can make seemingly naive points. It is good to advertise because when you are more famous, more opportunities happen. Okay? One of the great things about fame is in some ways, fame is a kind of insurance policy. In that the more people have heard about you, the more people are going to come to you with interesting proposals and ideas, some of which you can choose. Okay? Now, that's a very banal statement in one respect, and I'm not sure age 27 I would have felt comfortable making it. But you can do the Buckminster Fuller dare to be naive thing when you're 50. Because it then comes across as wisdom, not as oversimplistic.
Yeah. But it's I was intrigued by the 45 ticker. Is that why when we have to ticker those little boxes to mark our age range, they pick the 5s as the start point of the next range?
I wonder. I don't know why that is. Funnily enough, I've got a very, very big worry about demography because the more you study marketing, the more you realize that demography is actually not very good. Okay. And okay. You will always see a correlation between wealth and people buying expensive products because people who aren't a reasonable level of wealth can't buy the product. And you will see significant correlations of age and the sale of reading glasses. Okay. I'm not disputing the fact that that isn't really telling you anything you didn't know already, right? And actually, this business of defining consumers and customers demographically rather than by values or by mental typology or attitude or locus of control or Big Five or personality, whatever it may be, is really pretty rubbish. And so one thing that concerns me, for example, is more and more forms demand to know your ethnicity. Okay. Now, in a world where everybody was a perfect statistician, I'd have no concern filling in any details. I'd just tell the truth about everything. There is an increasing move of people to refuse to answer those because their argument is, what we will end up with is a huge amount of data about discrepancies between ethnic groups, okay, in terms of who goes to university, who does this, Now, in many ways, that information may be totally useless because you may have half of an ethnic group going to university in disproportionately high numbers, and another part of that same group going to university in disproportionately low numbers, and it won't be noticed.
It's back to the danger of averages again.
Which is the huge danger of averages, okay? So, for example, West Africans seem to be disproportionately economically successful so far, in UK terms. Now, that could end up drowning out something else. Now, a question that's never asked, okay, is how many books did your parents have in their home? Now, that's a massive predictor of all kinds of things, okay? But it's not a question that was ever asked. Admittedly, it's a question you can lie about too, so you can game the system. But there is this concern, which is that we will end up with an extraordinary plethora of data about ethnic disparities, which in some cases may simply be what you might call a confounding variable. Okay, so ethnic minorities, for example, are disproportionately urban. So you may find out that it'd be very easy to find out, for example, that car ownership among ethnic minorities is much lower than it is, but then you're not comparing like with like. Now, the thing that concerns me here is not in a world of perfect statisticians. I wouldn't be worried about this at all. But if you look at the bell curve of statisticians, okay, it is patently obvious, if there is a bell curve of statistical competence, that really, really good statisticians who tend to go, I'm not comfortable about this, or have you considered what we're not measuring, are vastly outnumbered by merely competent statisticians who are somewhere to the... You don't have to worry about people who are rubbish statisticians because they know they're rubbish statisticians. They don't pretend to practice statistics, okay? But it seems to me that fairly competent to, just about okay statisticians are going to outnumber the really good ones by a factor of about 20 to 1, right? And so we should worry about the statistics we generate if disproportionately those statistics are going to end up in the hands of people who frankly aren't that great at understanding the limitations of statistical modelling or comparison.
Rory, what's that wonderful Ronald Coase quote? If you torture the data, it'll confess to anything.
And emphatically, people who are presented with a data set who have an agenda or an animus will always be able to find something. You'll always be able to find some disparity. But the whole way in which we break down the population seems to me, nobody questions whether demography has a problem. I mean, I'll give you a classic example of this: the standard misrepresentation of Brexit voters as being uneducated, which was really a product of them being older. Okay, because if you're in your 60s, 70s, and 80s, someone with a university degree is what, 4, 5, 6% of the population. If you're in your 20s, your early 20s, someone with a university, and I'm not even comfortable with having a university degree as being a useful measure of anything, right? It's really a measure of when you were born. And so, as a result, what happened is our idea of, say, the Brexit voter, okay, became ludicrously stereotyped with this single representative idea, okay, as some, by the way, they were always presented as being male, despite the fact that there was no gender split at all in the Leave vote. Okay, but for some reason, Brexiters were always basically angry, gammon-faced white men who were, living in the north in some sort of, basically in some sort of Rust Belt area. Okay, but Sevenoaks voted Leave, right? Okay, I mean, patently, okay, it was the extraordinary misuse of demographic information without any nuanced interpretation, which led to a ludicrous stereotyping of the two parties concerned.
Social media doesn't do nuance, Rory.
Doesn't do nuance, no. But I mean, obviously, far fewer people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, who you might also argue have life experience, which people aged 25 don't, regardless of whatever degree they have, okay, were basically presented as being idiotic. I mean, it was basically ageism disguised as some sort of something else. And so, I don't know that we shouldn't lie when we're asked a question about our ethnicity. I'd seriously raise the question whether we should just refuse to answer or lie. Interestingly, that's what Rob Henderson, who's the Cambridge guy who coined the phrase luxury beliefs, he refuses to answer those questions.
Love it. Gentlemen, time is almost upon us.
Can I make a recommendation? I know you normally ask us for books we've read that have changed our minds or helped us a long way. And only because I knew I read a book a few months ago, and it's by a magician. Don't know that book, but it's the most wonderful for anybody interested in behavioural science. And it's by a magician I admire hugely. I know him reasonably well, a gentleman called Joshua J. And Joshua J. has written a book for laymen, i.e. non-magicians, called How Magicians Think. And it is quite extraordinary in terms of the insights he provides to non-magicians about what goes through our heads. And it could be a book about behavioural science. It's extraordinary. And there are so many anecdotes in there that could be useful to people who are interested in this wonderful subject of behavioural science, that I'd thoroughly recommend How Magicians Think by Josh Jay. And just to give you one little thing that really resonated with me, or I'm sure it will with Rory or anybody who ever has to make a presentation or did go on stage as a public speaker. And Josh is asked, it's sort of kind of, each chapter is very short about little separate themes. Josh is asked what he thinks about before he goes on stage to perform. And he's the most wonderful polymath within the world of magic. He's an inventor, he's an author, he's a creator, he's a performer. He's absolutely terrific. He always tells himself this one little story, which is certainly something I'm going to think about a lot. He talks about a conductor, a musician who is about to go out, who's about to basically, the conductor's about to direct an orchestra, or conduct an orchestra, I should say, to play Beethoven's Fifth. It's a pretty well-known piece of music. And he says to his orchestra before the curtain's open, listen, you've all played this thousands of times, and the audience knows it and you know it. But tonight I want you to play for two distinguished guests. One member of our audience is a little girl who is hearing Beethoven's Fifth for the very first time. The second member of your audience is an old man who will be hearing it for the last time.
Wow.
Wow.
Now, just think about how you go on stage with those two thoughts in your head, with those two people in mind. And the book is full of a rich seam of this wonderful stuff. And he doesn't have any magic tricks. Of course, he doesn't do that. But he'll certainly tell you a lot about how your mind does and doesn't work. It's brilliant.
Well, I suppose we've talked about alchemy, we've talked about magic, and the third thing we haven't talked about, which is a close relative of both, is comedy, of course. And so I'll end with a book recommendation, which is a comic book called Understanding Comics. Now, that's actually about, to be honest, it's about how comics convey things, that we understand things from comic strips that we don't even realize we're understanding. You know, so much of it is a kind of tacit form of understanding. So that's my little book recommendation. But on the subject of comics in a different sense of the word comic, I also think that there's something very, very similar in terms of the magician is saying, I can't actually do this in reality, but I can make people see it. Okay? And the comedian is going, I can't actually say this literally, but I can say it in a way that makes it funny, and the response will be completely different. Okay? And you know, it's very interesting in terms of funny advertising. You can say things in a joke that you can't say deadpan. The Economist advertisements, okay, you know, management trainee age 42. If you'd actually stated your strategy, people who read The Economist are more successful in business, okay? You'd basically go, what a load of wankers, and no one would buy the publication, and a lot of people would stop buying it for fear of looking like an idiot. You say it as a joke, and you can say it. And that's, in a sense, the role, I suppose, of the jester within the court, which is the ability to say things that need to be said, that can only be said obliquely, amusingly. And so that's, I think they're all three are very, very closely related. In terms of, in other words, it's a function around perception. It's a perception-led mode of communication rather than a factually led mode of communication or transmission.
Amazing. What a fabulous way to close out. Thank you so much for everything you do, but particularly thank you both for sparing the time to come on the show with some incredible insights. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Absolute joy. Thank you again.
Edward de Bono, perception is real, even when it is not reality. Thanks for having me.
So that brings us to the end of this episode, and let me say a huge thank you to Paul and Rory for helping me see in the third century of the show. If you missed any of their previous appearances, have a look in the show notes, where you'll also find links to some of the subjects we touched on in the discussion. I also want to say an enormous thank you to you, my listeners, for all your support, kind words and constructive feedback over the past 200 episodes. The good news is that I've already got quite a few more episodes recorded, and some wonderful guests are scheduled to record a discussion in the next few months. As ever, feedback and thoughts are all welcome, good, bad or indifferent. And above all, If you like the show, please do either leave a review on the platform you use to listen to it on, and or share episodes you like on social media. To get in touch with me and find out the work that I do with my clients, helping them mitigate their human risk, visit human-risk.com, and also join me on Twitter or LinkedIn. Just search for Human Risk and you'll find me. I will be back very soon for the 201st episode in this series. But in the meantime, stay safe, and thank you so much for listening.